So the thing the public should know is that we don't necessarily need to have this kind of diagnostic knowledge of doshas. It's more about knowing what general states of balance look like.
I'm Heather Grish, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrish.com or on Instagram at heathergrish. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Why does it seem like so many of us wake up one day and say, I got to go to India? Even some tech people like Mark Zuckerberg, Mark Benioff, and the late Steve Jobs have reported that they went there to find themselves at some point. My guest today first heard the call at age 19, and I heard it in my late 30s. A trip there will mystify you, and it will bring you to your knees at some point. You will observe every single incarnation of the concept of God, or nature, or whatever the heck you want to call it. And this place will also completely disgust you. You'll get really sick at some point, and you probably won't even want to bring your shoes home with you. But you'll be intrigued. You'll long to go back, and yet somehow you'll appreciate where you came from more, especially if where you live has clean water, air, and farmlands and rivers that are not full of trash. My guest today also has a love affair with India, and perhaps it's through all the ways that India has challenged her and at the same time given her all the remedies to heal herself and others that keeps her spreading the wisdom of India's traditional form of medicine called Ayurveda. What exactly is this call to Mother India? Let's tune in and drop in. You're listening to the Wisdom of the Body. Today, I'm here with Kate O'Donnell, who's the author of the Everyday Ayurveda series of books on the Ayurveda diet and lifestyle. These have all been published with Shambhala Publications. She's an Ayurveda practitioner, a yogi, and the founder of the Ayurvedic Living Institute Online. Thanks for joining us, Kate.
Thanks for having me, Heather.
So, Kate, my Ayurveda colleague, so excited to talk with you today. And, we've been doing a little bit of collaborating lately, just getting to know each other a little bit better, actually, I feel. And I was really excited to talk with you today about all the background on how you got into writing your books on Ayurveda. How did you become interested in Ayurveda in the first place?
The interest was really because I was in India. I started traveling there early in college. When I was 19, I went there to teach English at a village school in South India, like near to Auroville. So I had all sorts of parasites going on after my first couple months there. And that was how I got into Ayurveda, because I was looking for ways to treat the parasites. I didn't even know anything about Ayurveda. It wasn't like I went to India because of yoga or Ayurveda. It was just, I think, somewhere I had always wanted to go. Now I know why, like there's a karma there. But once I went through the treatments at the Ayurvedic hospital, I had this awakening. It was really kind of an enlightenment experience. And that is what got me to the point where I wanted to know as much as I could about Ayurveda, because I thought, this is amazing. Like, this system is amazing. It's a health system, but it's also deeply spiritual. It's a spiritual path. And that's what got me studying. And I started doing yoga at that time as well. So along the last 20 some odd years, I've been studying both yoga and Ayurveda, mostly in India, kind of side by side. So there's ways that they are similar and connected, and ways that they're different. And it's been really rich, to study both of these Vedic pathways along the last couple decades.
So you were 19 when you first went to India, because I didn't actually go to India till I was in my 30s. And you knew about Auroville, which I don't know if all the listeners know what Auroville is, but Auroville is this really super cool ashram outside of Pondicherry, which was founded by a man named Sri Aurobindo and his collaborator, which they refer to as the mother.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, just for interest, I find it really interesting. And I've been there just one time and I love that place.
Mm-hmm.
How did you hear about Auroville at 19?
I know, right? Yeah. It was actually, I mean, I had always wanted to go to India. And then when I heard about Auroville, I was like, oh, yeah, like I'm in. And it was when I was in college, I was at the University of New Hampshire. And this man, Daniel Greenberg, came in. And he was from an intentional community in Western Mass called Sirius, as in the constellation Sirius, Sirius.
Yeah.
Because everyone's like, Sirius? There's a place called Sirius?
That's my mom's nickname for me.
Right, exactly. So it's not that kind of serious. But he came and was discussing a program called Living Roots, which is actually still in operation. It's still around. If any of our listeners today are interested in learning more about intentional community living, that's what Living Roots does. So one of the stops along the way in this program, it was just about like getting to India, but I was also interested in communal living. So we went to Thich Nhat Hanh's monastery first in Plum Village, France, and we spent like 10 days there. There was a group of 10 of us, 10 college students. And then we went to Auroville and we spent a couple of months there, and everyone had to kind of do a service project. And that was where I started teaching English. And I was blown away, Heather, by Auroville. I ended up going back there a number of times, like year after year. And I started working with Living Roots programs and working with the students when they were in Auroville to kind of orient them. And I taught yoga classes to the groups. And I really thought I would live in Auroville. I was just trying to figure out how to make enough US dollars over there that I could still come home and see my parents like once a year. And that was like the struggle for me. But eventually my intestines just said, no, like, I'm sorry, we can't do this. And after maybe 4 trips there over the course of 5 years or so, I was just like really a mess. And that was when the Ayurveda and I got real together because I really had a lot of problems. It was another 5-year journey of like really, because I was so young, Heather, when you're like 20 years old, you're not like necessarily on your dinacharya daily rituals. And it was at that time, it was my mid-20s where I was like, I am sick, and
I was smoking cigarettes at that age.
Totally. Oh yeah. I mean, all the stuff I was doing in India, it wasn't necessarily yoga. Like I was partying pretty hard over there. That's probably why I got so sick. But I just ended up back in the United States and was like, and that was where all of the routines and the diet and the use of herbal medicines and everything that I'd been learning over that last, say, 5 years of traveling back and forth to India and working with yoga and Ayurveda. Then I was back in the States and like accepted that I needed a few years off and not going to India because I just had to, my immune system was all whacked out. It was like it didn't know what continent I was in, and so I couldn't really fight anything off. So I was just getting like every kind of cold and flu, and I really worked on my health for a while. And it was also during that time that I started studying Ayurveda in the United States at the Kripalu School of Ayurveda, which is also still there. That school's been around like maybe 13 years now. And that was when I started to really understand, because I was learning from English speakers. All of the doctors teaching in that program were teaching in English. So that then so many things started to really make sense to me.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to understand a subject if it's not being taught in a language that you understand.
Yeah. And so, so much of Ayurveda is Vedic. There's like, when you go for a BAMS, like a Bachelor's of Ayurvedic Medical Science, the first year is philosophy. It's like learning the Vedic way of seeing. And I had to, like, as a Westerner, it's quite opposite from how we grow up, like perceiving the world. So it's been this slow, like trickling process of shifting the way that I view reality. And then it's like the Ayurveda is present all the time in how I view life, and my climate and my food and my interactions and all that stuff now, it has taken on a completely different hue. But that took like a decade.
Yeah, and I'm kind of curious because so you're talking about how it's so different than how we grew up. 19 years old, being receptive to go to India. Did you grow up with hippie parents? That's my assumption. I would be like, oh, you'd have to have hippie parents if you heard about Auroville at 19.
Right. Oh, no. My parents were deeply spiritual people, but they were an ex-nun and an ex-priest. We're obviously an
Oh,
Irish family, given my last name.
yeah.
So both of my parents, they're a little bit older they're like 10 years older than everyone else's parents. Because they had been monastic for a decade or so before they kind of decided to have a family. So I grew up in a super sattvic household for sure, but it was not about like travel and like hippie living. And I mean, my parents were kind of beside themselves when I told them what I wanted to do, but they were always supportive. I think that for themselves, they understood that concept of having a spiritual quest, even when you're that young. Like they both joined a monastic community when they were 18 years old. So,
Yeah.
they couldn't really blame me for wanting to do that. And instead of going in the Catholic direction, I went Vedic.
Yeah, I was raised Catholic too, so I have that similar background, and I also grew up on the East Coast, so
Mm.
that's super cool. Yeah, so I guess in a way, it's not a weird thing that you did jump culture
Right.
and, in some way, but it was probably kind of like a normal thing to your parents. Like, sure, she wants to go stay at an ashram in India. That's super cool.
Right. Yeah. I think it was certainly scary for them, but
Oh, really?
well, yeah, back in 98,
Just being out of the country?
it was like, nobody had cell phones. The internet was barely there. It was just very difficult to communicate with them. And that first time I was gone for 6 months. So it was just harrowing, I think, for them to imagine me in this completely foreign place, unable to communicate with them.
Yeah, their baby.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's funny because when you were in Auroville and you said you were going to Ayurvedic hospital there, did they have an Ayurvedic hospital in Auroville, which was the ashram, or was it right outside of Auroville in Pondicherry or that area?
So actually, my trips to India, once I started doing yoga, I was practicing a style of yoga that's seated in Mysore, in
Mm,
Karnataka, which is basically straight across. If you go across from Auroville all the way to Karnataka, you hit Mysore. And so I would travel between the two. I would spend a couple months in Auroville and then go to Mysore, and that's where the Ayurvedic hospital was.
I see. Yeah,
Hmm.
so you're into Ashtanga yoga, which has a reputation for being the intense athletic form of yoga.
Right.
And I've seen pictures of you doing yoga, so you're definitely an Ashtangi. I could tell.
So I
And
started young.
yeah, exactly. It's amazing. So, do you teach Ashtanga as well?
Heather, I stopped teaching yoga about at least a year ago, maybe a little more than a year ago. I held a community together in Boston for 12 years, teaching at 6:30 in the morning every day or 6 days a week. And I moved from Boston. And so it's interesting because my husband, Rich, has actually taken over the Ashtanga teaching. We taught together for 7 years. Now he still does it. I just want my mornings back
Mm.
basically. So, it's interesting because the Ayurveda kept calling me. It was like all this demand for my teaching, my writing, my presenting, consultations. And it was like, I felt like I was doing everything. And I kept having to say no to Ayurveda because the
Hmm.
yoga teaching was really taking so much of my energy. So once I sort of quieted that down, and I still obviously practice yoga and it's just for me, I don't teach it anymore. But now I have a lot more energy for Ayurveda. And to me, I'm not a huge fan of the directions that yoga's been going in America anyway. The business of it, it really doesn't work for me. And so with Ayurveda, it's like there's so many directions you can go with it. Like I'm writing about one thing, you're writing about this whole different thing. And, there's just so many aspects of Ayurveda that can be fleshed out. And I love that. So I feel like I have the rest of my life to continue to explore all the different different avenues and different specialties in Ayurveda.
That's kind of an interesting coincidence because I actually stopped teaching yoga last year as well.
Oh, funny. I didn't. Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't teach as much as you. I never was a full-time yoga teacher, but like for 10 years I taught part-time.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a similar thing. For me, it was once I wrote my book, The Ayurvedic Guide to Fertility, that I just wanted to put my energy there. I
Right.
just felt, yeah. And it felt like just even having to show up for the couple of classes a week that I was doing felt like time I should have been focusing on writing my book and doing all the things that I really wanted to do, even though, yes, like I love yoga as well. And after all this time has passed and I have a child, so I've little less time to focus on myself in the
Mm-hmm.
mornings
Mm-hmm.
than I used to. But my practice has slipped a lot since I've stopped teaching and I've had to like fight to get it back. Because I think part of teaching for me has always been reinforcing something that I learned that I want to keep in my life.
Yeah.
I feel I learn more by teaching than not more, but you learn when you're a student, but then once you teach that to other people, you continue to learn because you learn through someone else's eyes too. At that point, you're like, oh, just magnifies it for yourself. And I miss that part as well. So that's an interesting coincidence. And I really relate to you because yoga is part of what we do in Ayurveda, and it's part of, say, the therapeutic regimen that many of us will recommend for our clients. So I would imagine that you're still sort of integrating yoga into your practice in some way. So if you're having a consultation, are you still recommending, any breathing practices or yoga asanas, things like that, yoga poses?
Sometimes I am. It's funny because I think that I had such a specialized skill set as a Mysore style Ashtanga yoga teacher
Mm.
that I really became, if I do say so, quite masterful at seeing bodies in that environment and guiding people in that specific practice. And it's such a systematic view of yoga that for me to be working with a client, for instance, where we're talking about diet, we're talking about daily routines and sleep and all this stuff, I feel like I don't so much want to give them a yoga posture or two. If I were to do anything, I would want to set them on the path of developing a home yoga practice,
Hmm.
which is its own thing. I
Yeah,
really
totally.
think, that's its own endeavor. And like I am one of the co-founders of the Boston Ayurveda School. So when students go through that program, it's like in that kind of environment we can work on that because they're with me for a year.
Hmm.
And so I think I'm just very selective about how I integrate yoga because I'm kind of all or nothing about it because I think
Mm.
my experience with yoga is so deep and it's deeply sacred to me. And I don't want to compartmentalize any aspect of it.
Yeah.
So I enjoy working with people who have a practice and a lot of Ashtanga yoga. A lot of my clients are found me through the Ashtanga yoga circuit and are like, oh, finally someone who understands my practice and can also help me with the rest.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of that. And then I love working with yoga teachers and yoga students because I think people in the yoga world are looking for more. They're looking to go deeper in the Vedic traditions and they're coming to Ayurveda because of that. And they're like, it's not just about posture. It's like, I know there's this whole other thing going on. How can I learn about that? How can I integrate that into my life?
Right. And they know it's not, even if they've gotten into meditation, they also know it's beyond their mind. You probably hear a lot because people are always using Ayurveda as kind of like a typecasting method. We like to stereotype people using the doshas because we've turned it into the Enneagram.
Yeah, you're so right.
Anyway, I just want to laugh at that. It's hard not to do it. And I always I kind of criticize people for doing it, but I do it too because I can't get myself to not do it. And I know all the Indian practitioners and doctors hate us for it, that we've sort of made Ayurveda this cookie cutter thing here in the US. But I think it's part of the learning when you first get exposed to something and how the assimilation process cognitively works for people. So when we talk about vata, pitta, and kapha, the doshas, which I believe I've had another guest explain on the show before, but maybe we can talk about that for a minute since we may have some people listening who don't know what Ayurveda is and want to know what we're talking about. So could you explain what doshas are to people and why we should care about them?
Yeah, doshas are the five elements that make up the human body, compound into pairs that perform specific functions. Like, for example, space and air compound together because air wants to move and space creates the field for that movement. So we have these spaces in our body, like the gastrointestinal tract, and there's a current that moves through it, right? Like we know that food goes in one end and poop comes out the other. Like we don't have to learn that or think about that. It's like this inherent like movement system in the body. So all that stuff is governed by what's called vata, and vata means that which moves. And it's a combination of the functionality, the energy, as well as the physicality of the space and air elements when they get together in a body. And that's awesome, right? Like we love that. We need that. However, what the ancients observed through their thousands of years of human trial and error was that anytime something goes wrong in the body in a way that leads to a disease process, it had something to do with these three compounds, vata, pitta, and kapha. And so they called them as doshas. Rather than just a functional compound of the elements doing these great jobs in the body, vata can become vata dosha when it gets out of its relative state of balance in a person's body. So the word dosha means that which is at fault or that which is faulty. So we have these three compounds in our body that do movement. Pitta does transformation. Kapha does cohesion, like holding things together. So we have these three basic energies of things moving around the body, things being broken down inside the body, and things being maintained, like our tissues being maintained in the body. And the thing we want to understand is that each of those compounds has a potentiality to get out of balance and lead to diseases. So the Ayurvedic process of maintaining health is to understand the signs and symptoms in one's particular body of how any one or more of those compounds might be getting out of balance. And if you catch it, you use some sort of an intervention, whether it be diet or a lifestyle thing like changing the time you eat or sleep, for example. Or it could even be an association, like how you spend a lot of your time, what kind of environment you're in, or your climate or something like that. And those interventions change the trajectory of the dosha. So instead of it sort of moving on along in its disease process direction, we intervene and shift it and pacify that compound and bring it back into its relative state of balance in the body. So the thing that like the public should know is that we don't necessarily need to have this kind of diagnostic knowledge of doshas. It's more about knowing what general states of balance look like. Like pooping and digesting and sleeping, like sort of what's the ideal? Like what can we expect? And if we can maintain most of those physiological functions in the body in a healthy way, then we're not looking at disease.
Are you kind of curious about how creation works? It's not really easy for our intellectual minds to get it. My book, The Ayurvedic Guide to Fertility, outlines the 4 fertility factors of Ayurveda, and these factors can be applied to whatever seeds you're trying to plant right now, conceiving a child, creating a new business, or planting a garden on your back patio. Head over to heathergrish.com to learn about the book. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. Yeah, because after meeting with clients, you start to notice that the same conditions start to get caused by behaviors that are really like not wise behaviors. Like,
Right.
Oh, I have a headache because I've been drinking, 4 cups of coffee a day every day for 10 years. And
Right.
my digestion, I've got loose bowel movements because I just eat salt and vinegar potato chips in between my meals every day. Once you learn about Ayurveda, you start to understand the physiological functioning is being affected by your behavior. Let's give a practical example of the doshas for people, just briefly. I love the way you explain that. I think it's great. And in terms of maybe one of the doshas, if you could pick one of the doshas, vata, pitta, or kapha, just to give a super practical example of how somebody might feel that in their body.
Yeah, absolutely. We could shift to using kapha, how about that, as an example, which is a combination of earth and water elements. And so it does this maintenance and this cohesion in the body. It creates structure, like, your tissues are being built all the time. And it also does lubrication. So it's responsible for like your synovial fluid and the mucous membranes in the body. So because earth and water are very heavy and moist, that's the tendency for a body, a person who is born with a predominance of earth and water elements. And we call them a kapha type. And they have a tendency to be mucousy, right? It's just the way their body goes. And so if they were to do something like take a lot of mucus forming food, like ice cream is a great example. Because I think most people, if they eat too much ice cream, you get the sniffles. Most people that will happen because it's the nature of ice cream is so cool and sticky and moist and a little bit oily and heavy, right? All the same qualities as kapha, as this earth and water compound. So if we take in things that have the same qualities as our constitution, that's how the imbalance happens. So somebody overeats ice cream on top of already having moist and dense qualities in their body. Say it's raining and it's like moist out. It's like not the ideal time of year to be eating ice cream either. So all these factors come together to create, say, a propensity for this person to have seasonal allergies or to come down with that cold, right? Because the body can't fight it because it's already got too much mucus. Maybe it's in the lungs, maybe it's in the sinuses, maybe it's in the stomach. So this person might experience like the sniffles. They might wake up feeling like a little sinus pressure in the mornings and feeling really kind of like foggy in their head. And they might also have a lack of appetite. Like that ice cream starts like sitting around in the stomach. And so then they don't digest any of their food well. And that also makes you feel kind of foggy and slow.
My kapha must be high because I literally am sitting here feeling like I want to puke. Like listening to all these descriptors, I'm like, oh my God, my kapha must be high because all of those descriptors, as I start to feel them in my body, it's like, I can't handle any more of that energy right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So, and it's funny because we'll have to talk about, how we determine if, what doshas are out of balance for people, when we're doing diagnosis. But before we go there, say a person is figuring out, like, say a person notices that they do have high mucus, they do have this high kapha, or they do have this body that's like, it's a builder body, gaining tons of fat, or they're gaining tons of muscle, they're just gaining, or they're growing skin tags and tumors and cysts or whatever's happening. What kinds of things could they do to counterbalance that mechanism?
Well, the law of opposites is what we use for therapy. So the person would want to introduce light, warm, and dry qualities, which could be, for example, like polenta. Corn is dry and it's served warm, or eating, like, instead of taking meat, which is also a builder, taking beans, which are still satisfying, but they're a little on the drier side. And you don't have to serve them dry. Of course, you still cook them well. And yeah, you make all different kinds of things you want with them, but eating more vegetables and less heavy food like dairy and meat, that kind of stuff, allows the body to manage those building qualities that are already going on within instead of exacerbating them. And another thing that's just ideal for this particular scenario is exercise. motivating circulation in the body. It warms things up. A little bit of sweating can dry things out. And as we get more advanced, we have drying therapies, where we might apply like a chickpea paste to the body to remove moisture. Like, I'm not saying people are going to do that at home, but if you're in the Ayurveda hospital, that's the kind of thing that they do to you. But a lot of this stuff can really be done at home by just changing your diet a little bit and maybe adjusting your exercise regimen accordingly.
And so those of you guys who don't know Kate, she's written 3 books and a lot of them have recipes in them. And she's a fantastic cook. And in fact, we recently did a fun little Instagram live together where she taught me how to cook a recipe, because you may know that I don't like to cook. And Kate does like to cook. And I always like to hang out with my friends who do like to cook, because I'm thinking maybe they could help me like to cook more. So, she has a really great way of explaining in her books, what the action is of a certain food, because everything that you take in will have a certain effect on your body, your emotional state, and things like that. And not just the foods, but like you could look at foods like their friends. Everyone you're around has an effect on you, or the certain types of plants that you have outside and things like that. So check out Kate's books. When I was in Ayurveda school and we were learning how to take the pulse, which is one of the ways that we learn to diagnose in Ayurveda. When we were learning pulse diagnosis on students, we were doing it in pairs of 4. We'd have a client come in and I'd be with my little group, so 3 other of the students, and we would all take the pulse, and we would talk afterwards about what we got as a pulse reading. I don't know if you did something similar to that when you were in school.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I noticed was that everybody was reading the pulse differently. And in my group, it was interesting. We had 2 people that had very similar body types, and then the other 2 of us had very similar body types. And I noticed that those pairs, like the ones of us that had more similar body types, we were reading the pulse similarly to each other. So 2 of us were reading the pulse one way, and 2 of the students were reading the pulse a different way. And it was consistent that we were all reading it the same way for all of the clients. And so it got me thinking about when we take a pulse in Ayurveda, and this has to do, I think, with perception. And that perception, obviously is bigger than the mind. It affects, the sense organs are a factor and things like that. This might be a little bit of a dorky discussion for our listeners, but let's do it, Kate. What do you think about when someone's taking a pulse? What are the things that you think will affect that person's ability to read it accurately?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question, Heather. I think that, Ayurveda tells us that we gravitate towards the familiar. So the untrained observer might, it's going to be easier to recognize things in other people that are also familiar to ourselves. I've noticed that about myself. Like, I'm a pitta prakriti. That's my primary elements are fire and water. And when I meet a pitta type, I recognize it immediately. Whereas I have less kapha in my system. And so a kapha type is like, when I meet kapha types or I have clients who are kapha types, I'm like so stoked to get to know them better. Like, what happens when you do this? Ooh, what happens when you do that? To really learn about how kapha is and how it acts. And that same thing happens in the pulse. Absolutely. You recognize these familiar qualities because you know them well. So they just jump out at you. I think the thing about the pulse is I do view it as a very mystical activity. I think that it's the nadi, it's the energy pathway in the body. I think that one needs to get out of the way. Like, I think that the ability to step outside of the small self is necessary in order to take an accurate read of another person. Because if there's any Kate going into this particular activity, it's going to mess things up. And so,
it's going to color it.
Yeah, exactly. Kate's going to be in there with her preconceptions, and perception itself is like the purusha is actually free of personality, free of the limiting container of individuality.
Talk about what purusha is for the listeners.
Well, Purusha is, our yoga students will have heard of it. It's the principle of pure consciousness. So it's like isness, right? And it's all of the activity and the tangibility in the world come from the Prakriti, which means it's like Mother Nature or primordial matter. And so everything that has a shape and a form in this universe also has a consciousness. You know, like a squirrel does squirrel-like activities because the consciousness in the squirrel body is identified as a squirrel. You know, so that Purusha comes into a human body and it does human activities. And it goes further in Kate's body, you know, so that pure consciousness is inhabiting this vehicle or this container and begins to, through the ahamkar or the ego, begins to identify and self-identify. And this is like something that we're very good at. Americans especially just are awesome at cultivating the ego. Like individuality, you know, is a big part culturally of America. And it's the undoing of that allows us to drop into the nadi, you know, to the energy pathway where it's a formless sort of movement of energy. And so we're feeling that movement of energy in another container, you know, when we feel the pulse in another person. And if the mind is identified as Kate going in there, it's going to bring Kate-like qualities to the activity.
And I think we do that just when we're not taking the pulse tube. You know, we're talking about, Kate and I are talking about pulse diagnosis in Ayurveda, and it's, you know, when you put 3 fingers in the radial artery, there's a certain way that we, you know, press down into there and feel for certain sensations. But you could say taking a pulse is a metaphor also for just how we perceive people through our senses when we're around them. So I think a lot of what you're saying could be applied to that as well, and to this idea of projection,
Mm-hmm.
of what we do with people in the world. And it can be really confusing sometimes to identify when we have a certain belief or thought or an opinion about something, if it's really there or if we're bringing some of our stuff into it. What's the process like? What do you go through in your life to figure out if you're doing that?
Well, I'm definitely always observing, you know, and that was part of my early training through spending time with people like Aurovillians who are really committed to being quite conscious in their daily activities, being aware of the self and of who's showing up throughout the day. I think it's because I have a practice of doing that regularly that then when I say into a consultation with another human being, it's like all of that practice, you know, of all of the yoga and all of the meditation and all of just the consciousness throughout my daily life for the past couple decades, that comes to the forefront and allows me to then use these, like I've cultivated qualities of observation or the ability to observe without coloring it too much. Or if I do, I'm more likely to see myself doing it and be like, whoa, oh, hey, there's that. We need to come away from that. And so I do think that like personal practice is really important for us as Ayurvedic practitioners because otherwise, yeah, our ability to perceive people clearly is not going to be easy to come by.
Mm. Yeah, I love that you keep bringing up Auroville, because one of the things I wanted to mention to you is that when I was in India and I went to all these different temples, and I was really trying to connect with the divine feminine when I went to India, and I was going to all these different temples and I was looking for all the goddesses and where was the goddess showing up everywhere. And that was something I was contemplating a lot while I was there. And I grew up Catholic, so the fact that I'm, 30-something-year-old woman looking for goddess deities in India, and I also was like agnostic and for most of my life. And one of the TV shows I was obsessed with when I was in college was The X-Files, and I always identified more with Scully. I was definitely more of a science-oriented person for a lot of my life. So it was weird that I was there doing that. But one of the things I realized when I was at Auroville was that they had no deities anywhere there. A lot of the ashrams will have a temple there, and they'll have, maybe Hanuman or some god there that, is prominent. And Auroville didn't have any deities. And they had plants around, though. They had plants, and they were talking about the scientific names of the plants and what the plants do. And I felt more spiritually connected at Auroville because there weren't deities around. And I felt like I got all that sort of mind chatter about people's behavior and stuff like that out of my head by just being around plants. And that was a really big learning for me there. They also have that like super cool crystal there. Was that crystal there when you were there?
Oh yeah, I had a couple of sort of out of body experiences in the Matra Mandir, which was ultimately what kept me coming back to that place, was my experience in that meditation hall. It was the kind of thing where like time and space were altered. A few hours would go by and I don't remember anything. I'd come out and like the sun had set. I'd be like,
Oh, wow.
what just happened? I ended up volunteering to clean the Matra Mandir every evening just as a way to begin to spend more time in the space and get to know it better. But I feel like part of Aurobindo and the mothers, science was actually about Purusha. It was the interaction of human consciousness and divine consciousness. That was the science going on there. And so it wasn't necessarily requiring shapes and forms in the way that the gods and goddesses represent. Not to say there's anything wrong with that or it doesn't work or anything like that, but I think that what Sri Aurobindo and the mother were doing was different in that way, because they were like cutting out the middleman.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what it felt like to me. And I didn't get to go to that meditation hall you were talking about. And I regretted that. And if I ever go to India, I'm going back there.
I know, it's hard to get in.
Yeah, it was kind of a bummer. I didn't even know about it before I went. Wow, this was such a fun conversation. And gosh, I feel like I have so many more things that I want to talk about with you. So we'll have to do this again.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. So, Kate, let's share with the listeners if they want to get in touch with you, if they want to read your books, if they want to do any work with you, how should they look you up?
My website is kateodonnell.yoga. So people can contact me through there. They can also get information about consultations. My schedule is there. And there's links to my online classes. So I've just created an intro to Ayurveda course if anybody's looking for that, to dive in there. And I'm also doing a lot of live online cooking events, which is a fun way to spend more time together. So I would love to meet some of your people there.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming today, Kate, and lovely chat. And I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day.
You too, Heather. Thank you. And thanks to the listeners.
Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.